Our topic today is Jürgen Habermas, who has emerged as one of the most prolific and influential philosophers and social theorists of our era. Associated with the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, Habermas is now seen as the central figure in the second generation of the Frankfurt School, succeeding his predecessors Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse, and continuing their efforts to develop a critical theory of contemporary society and to develop a philosophy and social theory up to the challenges of the contemporary era. In particular, Habermas's writings on the public sphere and democracy, on language and communication, and on the major philosophical, cultural, political, and historical events of the day have won him global acclaim, and he is probably today one of the best-known theorists in the world, at least among intellectual circles, if not the general public. Because of the tremendous magnitude of his publications, entire books have been published listing his bibliography, and due to the complexity of his thought, I'm going to introduce different stages of Habermas's writing, depicting in sequence his writings in the 1950s and the 1960s, his linguistic and communicative turn of the 1970s, and his subsequent development of a theory of communicative action that he makes the basis of his philosophy and social theory, his moral theory, and his theory of democracy. In conclusion, I'll sum up what I consider the major themes and significance of Habermas's work, but also some of their limitations. Jürgen Habermas is a German. He's still alive, so he's a contemporary figure who I know personally quite well. He was born in 1929 in Düsseldorf, Germany. He grew up in Gummersbach, where his father was the director of the Chamber of Commerce. While he was a member of the Hitler Youth as a young boy, the German surrender of 1945 was a liberation for him, and henceforth he would be strongly critical of anything having to do with fascism. So we excuse him his Hitler Youth, since he's emerged as a major critic of German fascism. In fact, I once asked Habermas if the American philosopher John Dewey had any influence on him, and he replied yes, that Dewey's strong notion of liberal democracy, of politics and the public, and of the active connection between theory and practice made a strong impression upon him when he was a youth after World War II. Habermas told me that after the war, American writings were in vogue in Germany. There were translations of Dewey's book, and that he and his members of his generation were very influenced by the liberal democracy and the public philosophy in Dewey's writing. And I think it's fair to say today that Habermas himself has emerged as one of the major theorists and defenders of liberal democracy in our day, and thus can be seen as a successor to Dewey, who during his lifetime was one of the major representatives of democratic theory, and I think this is true of Habermas today. Habermas is also a very important philosopher as well as a democratic theorist, and from 1949 to 1954, Habermas studied philosophy, history, and other topics in Göttingen, Germany, in Zurich, and in Bonn, and began publishing articles on various topics. One of his earliest writings that I think is most interesting is a critique of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who had supported fascism and who wrote in a 1953 treatise, Introduction to Metaphysics, that, quote, National Socialism was an encounter between technology with its planetary destiny and modern man. Well, Habermas saw Heidegger's view as a glorification of German fascism, of which he himself, of course, was severely critical, and he chastised Heidegger not only for supporting the fascist regime in the 1930s, but failing to ever criticize it, and in his 1950s writings to heroize it, to glorify it, as if this was some sort of world historical event in the encounter between technology and human beings. Indeed, Habermas would continue to criticize Habermas would continue to criticize Heidegger over the years. For a while, like many Germans, he was impressed by Heidegger's 1927 treatise, Being and Time, which many people consider as one of the great philosophical treatises of the 20th century. On the whole, Habermas thought that Heidegger promoted mysticism, irrational, and obscurantist modes of thought, whereas Habermas, defended Enlightenment rationalism, which he thought was a necessary condition of a healthy democracy. Heidegger, of course, was a critic of Western rationalism and thought that the subject-object opposition within Western reason, where the subject comes to dominate and control the world, alienated human beings from the natural environment. So Habermas had a philosophy of being, where he wanted to let being be, to let things appear in their presence, to reveal their meanings. And Habermas thought that this was an assault on reason and enlightenment that he thought was politically dangerous. In 1956, Habermas came to study in the fabled Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany, and he worked with Max Horkheimer and T.W. Adorno, who in retrospect are two of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century and with whom Habermas was closely associated. His first major publication, Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, was published in 1962. The text contrasted various forms of an active participatory public sphere in the heroic era of liberal democracy with the privatized form of spectator politics in a bureaucratic industrial society in which the media and the elites controlled the public sphere. Habermas generalized from developments in Britain, in France, and in Germany in the late 18th and the 19th century, and sketched out a model of what he called the bourgeois public sphere, and then he analyzed its degeneration in the 20th century. The public sphere for Habermas consisted of organs of information and political debate, such as newspapers and journals, as well as the institutions and sites of political discussion, such as parliaments, political clubs, literary salons, public assemblies, pubs and coffee houses, meeting houses, literary salons, and other public spaces where socio-political discussion took place. Habermas claimed that for the first time in history, individuals and groups could come together, meet, discuss affairs of public importance, criticize existing institutions and authority. They could shape public opinion, giving direct shape to their needs, to their opinions and their interests, while influencing political practice. This is what democracy is supposed to be. Participation, where individuals participate in public affairs of their societies, gain information, test out their ideas in discussion and debate, are exposed to other people's ideas, try to understand them, and reach consensus. And this is what happened, Habermas claimed, in the public sphere of the 18th century. Consider the pre-revolutionary America, where people started coming together in coffee houses, meeting in private houses or public spaces in Boston, Philadelphia, and the other sites of the American Revolution, where newspapers and journals that were critical of Britain were published, were discussed. This, for Habermas, is the public sphere that's between the private institutions of the family and work and between the state, which is, of course, the major political institution. The public sphere in civil society is that space that's between the state and private life, and Habermas thought that that was the heart and soul of liberal democracy in the 18th and 19th century, that it developed a space of institutions and practices where people could actually participate in public affairs, where they could organize against arbitrary and oppressive forms of political power. Now, the principles of the public sphere, which Habermas articulated in his book, involved an open discussion of all issues of general concern in which discursive argumentation was employed to ascertain general interests and the public good. Anything could be discussed in the public sphere, but rational discussion and debate was the norm. People had to give arguments, they had to make proposals, they had to try to reach consensus. So the public sphere thus presupposed freedom of speeches and assembly, a free press, and the right to freely participate in political debate and decision-making. After the democratic revolutions, Habermas suggested, the bourgeois public sphere was institutionalized in constitutional orders, which guaranteed a wide range of political rights and which established a judicial system that was to mediate between claims between various individuals or groups, or between individuals and groups and the state. So Habermas is theorizing democracy in terms of a separation of power, where you have a separation of power between the state, between the judiciary, but also the democratic public sphere, where you have a press, you have institutions of meetings, you have political parties, eventually you have unions where people can organize, they can debate, they can discuss issues of primary concern. Again, consider the American Revolution, where after the Revolution we were given in a Bill of Rights freedom of speech and assembly. Likewise, after the French Revolution, similar rights were given. So democracy was institutionalized after the American and the French Revolution in a constitutional order that guaranteed the integrity of the public sphere in the 18th century Enlightenment and the democratic revolutions that followed. However, the theme of Habermas's book, which is encapsulated in the title, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, was the decline in the 20th century of the vitality and the institutions of the public sphere. Like his teachers, Adorno and Horkheimer, in The Dialectic of Enlightenment, Habermas produced an account of how the bourgeois public sphere had turned into its opposite, how democracy had become undermined, and how a revitalized public sphere was necessary to revitalize democracy. Hence, Habermas analyzed the transition, the switch from the era of liberal democracy where people participated in a public sphere. Think of New England town meetings or small towns where people come together to debate, to discuss political issues, they make decisions, compared with the 20th century where people watch television. They get politics through the media, where politics becomes a form of spectator politics, where big corporations take over the institutions of public communication. For many decades in the United States, and when Habermas, there were only 3 television networks. When Habermas grew up in Germany, there was just one channel of public television in state television in Germany. Likewise, in the early 20th century, for instance, in Texas, there were hundreds of newspapers, whereas by the 1950s it dwindled to 1 or 2 newspapers in the major towns. So Habermas was analyzing the decline of the institutions of the public sphere from a proliferation of newspapers, journals, and different books and articles that proliferated ideas and information to control by the mass media. It was also a switch from a situation where people participated in political discussions, debate, they were active citizens, to where suddenly people are consumer citizens. They're consuming the media. They're maybe more interested in the consumer society and consumption and purchasing things than in politics and becoming citizens. So Habermas is analyzing the structural transformation of the public sphere, and thus the decline of democracy. Just as Adorno and Horkheimer had analyzed how Enlightenment and democracy had turned into their opposites in the 1930s, Habermas argued that the public sphere also, that at one time was an institution, a space of participation and of genuine, real democracy, had become a sphere of manipulation, where the political parties and candidates candidates try to manipulate you through advertising, through spin doctors. We're undergoing an election right now in the United States, so we're getting bombarded by political propaganda. Still, in some states like Iowa and New Hampshire, there are more institutions of public space where people can actually meet with the candidates and have real discussions, as opposed just to seeing sound bites on television. For Habermas, this constitutes a decline of the public sphere and a decline of democracy. So Habermas's project is to revitalize democracy, but also to revitalize the norms of social critique, to develop a new basis for philosophy, for democracy, for social theory that he will ground in language and communication. Let me try to explain how his analysis of the structural transformation of the public sphere and what he saw as the decline of democracy led him to come to a new standpoint for philosophy and for social criticism. Previously, Habermas and his colleagues in the Frankfurt School appealed to the norms of enlightenment, of reason, democracy, and freedom to criticize fascism and what they saw as the decline of democracy and reason in contemporary societies that were marked by manipulation and domination by big corporations, by institutions like the state, by the big media. In this situation, you could no longer just appeal to norms of reason, freedom, and democracy because they turned into their opposites, because reason had produced propaganda, manipulation, because democracy had been taken over and colonized by the mass media, because people were no longer participating in public affairs. Hence, Habermas concluded we needed to reconstruct reason and democracy. We needed to rethink what a live critical reason would be and how we could recreate a political democracy, a genuine participatory democracy. So this led Habermas to seek a new foundation for social critique, for democratization, and his innovation was turning to language and communication to try to generate the norms of critique. His argument is that language itself contains norms to criticize domination and oppression and is a force that could ground and promote social democratization. Habermas suggests that in the capacity to understand the speech of another person, to submit to the force of a better argument, and to reach consensus, Habermas found a rationality inherent in language itself, in what he came to call communicative action, that could generate norms to criticize distortions of communication and help create a more democratic social order. Developing what he called an ideal speech situation, Habermas thus cultivated grounds for social critique and a model for more democratic social communication and interaction in his philosophy of language. In other words, Habermas suggests that if we reflect on language and on communication and on what constitutes an ideal speech situation, we will see that unconstrained communication involves allowing everyone to participate in discussion, allowing everyone to provide arguments, to try to come to an understanding of the other's position, and to assent to the force of the better argument. Consequently, Habermas made his linguistic turn and turned to language and communication as a basis at once for social critique, democratization, and to establish critical theory on a stronger theoretical foundation and to overcome the impasse that he believed that the Frankfurt School had become entrapped in. They didn't really have a way to revitalize democracy. They didn't have a new model for democracy, and Habermas is going to offer it in his notion of communication. So, From this perspective of developing a theory of communicative action, of analyzing the role of language and communication in the development of personality, in moral development, in interpersonal relations that are obviously mediated by language and communication, in democracy that obviously involves communication and language, in thinking through the consequences of communication in every sphere of life, from egos and psychological development and the construction of identity to morality and moral relations with others, and to theorize philosophy, politics, and law. Habermas developed a critique of contemporary philosophy and social theory that he claimed failed to understand the importance of language and communication, and he developed a whole systematic philosophy where he develops this philosophy of language and communication and demonstrates its importance and centrality for human life and for a democratic social order. So I now want to explain some of the later books in which Habermas carries out this program. In his 2-volume magnus opus, Theory of Communicative Action, that was translated into English in 1983 and 1987, Habermas claims that all major social theorists, including Marx, Max Weber, Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, and a list of other major figures, all failed to develop a theory of communicative action and thus established their social theories on a problematic foundation. In other words, he argued that all the great social theorists of our day failed to understand society, failed to understand that society involved communication. It involved social relations that's mediated by language and communication. And by failing to theorize language and communication, the great classical social theorists had failed to really analyze what society was all about. In particular, he argued the social theorists assumed, and philosophers, a subject-object relation in which subjects relate to objects either in the mode of the domination of nature, as in science and technology, where the subject, through gaining science and technology, gaining scientific knowledge and applying technology, he tries to dominate the object, or the same model, he argued, was applied in politics and social life, where others are seen as objects of domination and manipulation. Obviously, the welfare state sees its clients simply as objects who are to be administered and given certain welfare programs. In elections, the politicians obviously see you, the public, as objects who are to be manipulated into voting. So both in social theory and social life, Habermas said this subject-object relationship was the dominant one, whereas Habermas wanted to replace this with a subject-subject, or the Latin terms he used were an ego-alter, a self-other relation that would be the basis of our relationship to the social world and to each other. We would try to cultivate self-other relations, social relations, rather than subject-object relations. And the way that Habermas proposed doing this was to develop his theory of communicative action. In fact, Habermas has a very interesting critique of Karl Marx and Marxism that we can apply to provide an analysis of the failure of socialism. And that is, Habermas argues that Marx's paradigm for social theory was production, that labor and production, subjects working on objects, workers working in a factory to produce things, was the model for society that Marx had, as opposed to a self-other relationship. Therefore, Marx couldn't have a theory of democracy. Even though Marx gave lip service to democracy, he didn't really have a model for democracy because he didn't have a theory of communication, of relationships between human beings, of the importance of language and communication in constituting democracy. Marx didn't have a theory of the public sphere, so that that socialism didn't really have a basis to develop a democratic foundation. And in fact, it's interesting that the Soviet Union followed this same production model of Marx, as well as the subject-object model in both the economy and in the polity, to the detriment of realizing what Marx conceived as socialism. It's not well known that one of the first things that Lenin did after the Russian Revolution was to send spies to the United States, to Detroit, to study the factory system, the system of mass production, of Taylorism, of the assembly line, and scientific management. And the same model was instituted in the Soviet Union. Taylorism, assembly line, scientific management, big production. So the workers didn't have democratic relationships at work. It was the same subject-object relationship, the same model of production in the capitalist countries. And things were even worse in the state, where the workers in the Soviet Union had no political freedoms, no rights, there was no communicative democracy. The state considered the workers, the people, as objects to manipulate and control in the Soviet Union, just like in fascism. So Habermas argues that these philosophical models are very important, that it's important to overcome this subject-object model, to replace it with self-other models, to have theories of democratization and theories of communication. Now, another distinction he makes that's an important one for his critical theory of society is one between the life world and the system that he uses as a central key to analyze contemporary societies. Habermas makes a distinction between the system, which is the economy and the state, that are governed by imperatives of money and power, and the human life world that is governed by the norms of communicative action, that our everyday life is ideally governed by social relationships between people, moral norms, interpersonal communication. And this, as we saw, was also the sphere of democracy in Habermas's article or book on the public sphere. What Habermas is worried about in the contemporary era is the colonization of the life world by the system, in which the institutions of the system, of the state, of the economy, of money and power, come to dominate the life world. So an obvious example is politics. Genuine democracy, on Habermas's analysis, is a participatory communicative relationship. But if you have colonization of politics by political parties, by the mass media, by political advertising, in which the media are trying to manipulate the public into voting according to image or according to sound bites or some sort of rhetoric or something that will induce voters to vote for politicians, you have a distortion of democracy and what Habermas calls as a colonization of the life world by the system. In fact, think of television and the media themselves in terms of colonization of the life world. Think that some figures indicate that the average American has the television on 8 hours a day. Now the internet, maybe 4 or 5 hours a day. To the extent that you're interacting with these technologies and these media, you're not really engaged in everyday relationships, etc. So Habermas wants to have a revitalization of democracy through language and communication. He argues that moral development requires learning to take the standpoint of other people, to see things from other point of view, to try to reach rational understanding of other people's position, to try to arbitrate arguments and conflicts through reason, consensus, etc. The moral development takes place through language and social communication. So you see the importance of language and communication for Habermas. If we want to develop our own personalities and constitute identities. We need to be able to use language and communication. If we want to constitute moral relations with others, we have to see understand their points of view. We have to respect them as people. If we want democratic politics, we have to participate in political debate where we assent to the force of rational arguments. We try to understand other positions. We try to reach consensus. Well, a lot of people criticized Habermas for being too idealistic, for just giving you an ideal of what democracy should be. And Habermas says, yes, of course. I know this is counterfactual. I know this is a normative ideal. I know this is not the way the world works. I know that power and manipulation is dominant in politics and everyday life. But we need these ideals. We need a democratic ideal. We need moral ideals. We need an ideal of undistorted communication, of an ideal speech situation to reconstitute reason, to reconstitute democracy, and thus to create a rational and a better democratic society. So this is Habermas's project to reconstruct philosophy and social theory on the bounds of communicative reason, and then to reconstruct and democratize society and politics on this basis.